Saul, Israel's first king. Although the country the Israelites had occupied was only slightly larger than the state of Vermont, its harsh terrain was a barrier to national unity. Split down the middle by a sharp rise of craggy hills with the steeply sloping Jordan Valley to the east and the flat plain of Sharon spreading to the west, the hilly landscape naturally divided Israel into a series of scattered settlements. Within these sharply outlined enclaves, the tribes remained independent of one another. They came together as a nation only for the annual renewal of the Mosaic covenant, for certain festivals, and to meet emergencies. This lack of unity made them highly vulnerable to the enemies that surrounded them. Here and there, some Canaanite strongholds still existed, but Israel's most formidable opponents were the Philistines. The Israelite militia was no match for these tough, well-disciplined warriors who opposed the copper and bronze weapons of the Israelites with iron swords and spearheads. The Philistines also zealously guarded the secrets of the iron smelting they had brought from their eastern Mediterranean home. Their swift, heavily armed charioteers easily crushed any unmounted opponents, striking from their cities on the coastal plain of Canaan. They were gradually swallowing Israel. By 1050 BC, they had seized most of the central mountain territory and had destroyed Shiloh, site of Israel's central shrine. Their powerful army was even augmented by mercenary divisions of Hebrews. The Philistines reinforced their domination by imposing a monopoly on metallurgy. So armed resistance was stifled because the Israelites had no access to the sharper, more durable iron weapons. No Israelite community was allowed to have its own forge. Farmers were forced to buy their plow points and other metal implements from Philistine smiths, and they were charged exorbitant fees for repairs. A king for Israel. Israel would soon have ceased to exist if the tribal elders had not decided on a course that was completely contrary to their traditions. They went to their spiritual leader, the prophet Samuel, and asked him to appoint a king. Samuel was indignant. God was the only king Israel had ever acknowledged. He had always brought forth men like Joshua and Gideon to lead the people in times of crisis. But the elders insistently demanded a king, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. Reluctantly, Samuel sought guidance from the Lord, who told him, "Hearken to their voice and make them a king." Then the Lord instructed him, "Tomorrow about this time I will send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people, Israel. He shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines." The ruler to be was already on his way to Samuel. It was Saul. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. His father, a wealthy Benjaminite landowner named Kish, had sent him to look for a herd of donkeys that had strayed from their property at Gibeah, 4 miles north of Jerusalem. After an unsuccessful search through the neighboring farmlands and hill countries, Saul and his servant arrived at a small walled town on a hillside near Ramah. The servant suggested that they seek the advice of a local wise man. The seer was Samuel. As Saul approached him, Samuel heard the Lord's voice. "Here is the man of whom I spoke to you. He shall rule over my people." Samuel took the young man in for the night, and early the next morning led him to the outskirts of the city. There Samuel stopped and ordered Saul to send his servant on ahead. Then the prophet drew a vessel made of ram's horn from the sash of his robe. Raising the horn over Saul's head, he anointed him with oil and revealed the Lord's will, saying, "You shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their enemies." Cautioning him to remain silent about the event, Samuel sent the newly anointed king on his way, and several days later summoned all the tribal elders to Mizpah. There, when the people were ready to acclaim their new monarch, they could not find him. Shy and still not used to the idea of being king, Saul was finally discovered hiding among the baggage. Generally, he was a popular choice, and as the assembled elders rejoiced, but some had reservations. A number of worthless fellows looked on Saul with contempt and refused to accept him as ruler. "How can this man save us?" they asked. Saul soon had the opportunity to prove that, though he might be humble, he was not meek. It was Samuel himself who was most reluctant about Saul's elevation. At the convocation ceremony, he continued to berate the Israelites for wanting a king. From the start, his attitude towards Saul was one of watchful suspension. Tactics of surprise. Not long after the ceremony at Mizpah, several men from the village of Jabesh Gilead in the Jordan Valley raced through the hills with an urgent plea for help. Nahash, king of the semi-nomad Ammonites, had crossed Israel's eastern border and laid siege on the community on the eastern edge of the Jordan Valley. Even though the helpless villagers offered to surrender, Nahash was not satisfied. He wanted to humiliate all Israel and demanded that the right eye of each man in Jabesh be gouged out. Confident of his superiority, he granted the village elders a 7-day grace period to seek outside support. Everywhere the messengers traveled, the Israelites wept over the plight of the men of Jabesh, but no one volunteered to help them. Still a farmer, Saul was plowing his field when he heard the news. Enraged by the cowardice of his countrymen, he slaughtered and dismembered his oxen on the spot, then sent the pieces throughout Israel with the ultimatum: "Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." The Israelites fell into line, and each of the tribes contributed troops. Saul mustered a large force and led them on an overnight march toward the Ammonite camp outside Jabesh. The army arrived in the early morning hours when light barely showed over the surrounding hills. Using whispered commands, Saul dispersed his forces into 3 companies. This 3-unit formation was common at the time, and Saul probably used the pattern for fighting most of his battles because it offered great flexibility. He could station one company on a fixed front with the other 2 flanking it on either side. 2 companies could remain in frontal position with the other ready to attack from the side, or 2 groups could attack while the third was held in reserve. The 3 units slowly converged on the Ammonites. Only a few dozing sentries were on duty as the Israelites crept silently toward their camp. Suddenly, the morning stillness was shattered as ram's horns signaled the order to attack. Brandishing their swords and spears, the Israelites' army rushed forward, cutting down many of the sleeping Ammonites before they could reach their weapons. The Ammonites were totally unprepared for such an attack. Saul's 3 companies seemed to be coming from every direction. By midday, the Ammonites were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. The tactics of surprise used at Jabesh also became an integral part of Saul's military style, an early form of what we would now call guerrilla warfare. His decisive victory prompted the Israelites to accept him as king without reservation. They wanted to execute those who had initially rejected him, but Saul granted amnesty to the offenders. "Not a man shall be put to death, for today the Lord has wrought deliverance in Israel," he declared. At the people's urging, Samuel held a formal investure at Gilgal. Saul was in effect elected king. The kingdom he established bore little resemblance to the feudal system of the Canaanites and Philistine city-states. Israel kept its tribal structure, and at first one tribe, Judah, refused to give Saul its complete allegiance. He did not establish a royal bureaucracy to exercise governmental control, and he levied no taxes. The limits of his authority were reflected in the simplicity of his court at Gibeah, where he lived with his wife and 3 sons and 2 daughters. There, amidst olive groves and vineyards, he built his headquarters on a high promontory overlooking the main road that led northward from Judah to Bethel, Shiloh, and Shechem. It was more like a military fortress than a royal residence, and although Saul was definitely in command, he did not take on many regal airs. He still planted his fields each season, and he may even have joined his men as they built the rough stone walls of his rugged citadel. Saul court at Gibeah. A subject summoned to Saul's court would enter a sparsely furnished throne room measuring only 15 by 24 feet. He would see none of the lavish silver, gold, or ivory ornamentation that decorated the palaces of neighboring monarchs. If the visitor were invited to dine, he would see servants hard at work in the kitchen area next to the throne room. Some might be roasting an ox or a lamb over a large open hearth. Others would be cooking the vegetables in clay pots or pouring olive oil from large clay storage jars. Bread was baked in stone ovens. The flour was probably ground in the courtyard where another servant drove an ox hitched to a heavy grinding stone. Elsewhere in the building, servants spun wool yarn to be dyed and woven into cloth for the royal family's simple garments. Upstairs were the private quarters of Saul and his family. Since Saul had not abandoned farming, the between-wall storerooms held plow points and other agricultural tools. And because the palace was a military outpost, the king's personal bodyguards used these rooms to hold their arsenal of sling stones and wooden or bronze-tipped arrows. This group of young men formed the nucleus of Israel's first standing army. After the inspiring victory over Ammonites, Saul turned his attention to Israel's chief menace, the Philistines. He gathered 3,000 of his best soldiers and dispersed them to 3 strategic locations. He himself commanded 2,000 men, about half of the Benjaminite village of Michmash, and the others spread through the hills around Bethel. 1,000 remained at Gibeah under Saul's courageous eldest son and second in command, Jonathan. It was Jonathan who struck the first blow of the campaign. He launched a surprise attack on the Philistine garrison at nearby Geba and easily routed the enemy. When the news of the defeat reached Philistine headquarters, the generals mustered a massive army of charioteers, horsemen, and infantry to fight against Israel. Saul waited for the approaching enemy near Gibeah in the hill country, where he knew the Philistine chariots and cavalry would be at a disadvantage. Somehow Saul and Jonathan had acquired some of the prohibited iron weapons. The vast majority of the Israelites who furnished their own weapons were armed with old-fashioned bronze swords, bronze-tipped spears, arrows, pikes, and slings. The slings were made of leather or cloth sewn into a pocket shape to which cords were attached. The slingman would place a stone in the pocket and whirl it around, then release the ammunition by letting go of one of the cords. Long practice made their accuracy deadly. A few of Saul's men may have had bronze helmets and breastplates and leather shields, but most were probably protected by nothing more than their short cloaks of rough cloth and their leather sandals. Saul was counting on their combination of rugged terrain and his own unorthodox tactics to overcome the superiority of the Philistines' numbers and their iron weapons. Following instructions given by Samuel speaking for the Lord, Saul withdrew his army to Gilgal, almost 13 miles away in the Jordan Valley. He was to hold his troop there for 7 days until the prophet arrived and offered a sacrifice before sending the men into battle. Meanwhile, the Philistine army had encamped at Michmash by the deep raven separating that settlement from the nearby Geba. The Philistine commanders stationed sections of their forces in a series of garrisons along the edge of the rocky divide. The soldiers marched to their posts with the sun reflecting off their bronze body armor, round shields, and feathered top helmets. The Israelites across the pass watched apprehensively as the enemy troops spread out like the sand on the seashore in multitude. The psychological impact of the formidable sight soon took its toll on Saul's camp at Gilgal. Each time the sun rose during the wait for Samuel, the king saw the size of his army diminished. Tension mounted, and when Samuel failed to appear after the appointed 7 days, the men began to desert en masse. They ran to the hills and hid in caves, hoping to escape the expected onslaught. In desperation, Saul offered to sacrifice himself. Suddenly, Samuel arrived in a storm of righteous anger. Saul protested that any further delay would have been fatal, but the prophet would not listen. "You have done foolishly," he raged. "You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and has appointed him to be prince over his people." Then the prophet departed angrily. By this time, Saul's army had dwindled to 600 men, and the Philistine had already dispatched 3 raiding parties into Israelite territory. Seemingly calm despite Samuel's rebuff, Saul returned to Gibeah and readied his forces to meet the invading army. There, a daring 2-man raid by Jonathan, a companion, started the overconfident Philistines. Lookouts quickly reported the enemy's confusion to Saul, who immediately seized the advantage and sent his troops up the pass toward the Philistine encampment. Saul took up his position at the head of his troops, clearly shielded by his guards. As the Israelites surged toward the main Philistine encampment, fear and confusion spread like an epidemic among the enemy. Their well-disciplined ranks crumbled into disarray. Many must have turned and ran. Suddenly, the Hebrew mercenaries in the Philistine army revolted against their masters and joined their Israelite cousins in battle. The Philistines found themselves attacked from all sides. The many Israelites who had timidly deserted Saul took courage when they saw what was happening. They grabbed their weapons and emerged from their hiding places in the hills to rally around their king. Saul's ragged band of 600 had swelled into an avenging army. He pursued the retreating Philistines through the hills and valleys. Mile after mile, the slaughter continued as the Israelites fought the foe westward past Arjon and into the coastal plain. Only when the remnants of the Philistine chariots reached the plain were there any of them able to escape. The Israelites sent them on their way with a cry of victory. Condemned by the prophet. The victory at Michmash was an enormous success for Saul. With a single stroke, he had ejected the Philistine occupation forces from the central mountain territory. The Philistine iron monopoly was shattered too, and the Israelites were able to forge stronger and more effective weapons and tools for themselves. Saul and his battle-hardened troops now had more freedom to operate against the Philistines and other enemies that regularly harassed the nation from every side. Before long, he marched south toward Judah, into the desert region of the Negev, where his army annihilated the surprised Amalekites. In the course of a successful war against the semi-nomads, Saul made a fatal blunder. He disobeyed Samuel's command to slay all of the foe and destroy all enemy property as a herald. To Samuel, Saul had committed the ultimate sin. He had placed his own judgment above the Lord's. The prophet denounced Saul and said, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." This breach between the monarch and the mentor was the beginning of Saul's slow downfall. Saul was under constant political pressure to maintain the unity of the tribes and keep his army intact. Philistine aggression never let up. Such steady stress would have challenged the resources of the most capable ruler. But to make matters worse, the instability of Saul's own personality now began to emerge, and he sank into prolonged periods of deep depression. His servants brought a young shepherd named David to play their lyre for the king, hoping it would cheer him. David's music did not seem to soothe Saul's melancholy moods, and the youthful harpist quickly became a court favorite. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. David soon became a national hero following his defeat of the Philistine giant Goliath. Impressed by David's daring and bravery, Saul gave him command of a division of his troops, unaware that Samuel had secretly anointed the youth to be king. Saul grows jealous of David. David repeatedly trounced the Philistine, and his popularity among the people of Israel grew rapidly. During a triumphant return from battle, Saul heard women in the streets chanting, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s." The king became enraged with jealousy, doubtless remembering Samuel's ominous prophecy. He thought, "And what more can he have but the kingdom?" From that point on, Saul regarded David as his enemy. Twice his anger erupted so violently that he hurled his javelin at David, who dodged away barely in time. In calmer moments, Saul plotted more subtle ways to rid himself of the boy he had once loved as a son. He used his daughter Michal as a ruse. David could have her in marriage if he battled the Philistines and returned with evidence that he had slain 100 of them. David slew 200, again and again. Saul dispatched David to fight the Philistines, but David remained victorious. The more Saul was thwarted, the more his malice deepened. But his children drew closer to David. On one occasion, Michal had to help her husband escape through a window when Saul's agents came to kill him. A deep bond had developed between David and Saul's eldest son. Jonathan alternated between pacifying his father's outbursts of anger and helping his friend avoid murderous traps. His friendship seems especially sincere because he, not David, was the logical successor to the throne. David, fearing that one of Saul's clumsy plots to kill him might eventually succeed, fled the court with a small company of renegades and malcontents. He darted from one Israelite community to another, pursued by Saul. In Saul's tortured mind, everyone had become a traitor, including Jonathan and his most trusted servants. Affection for David was equal to treason. The most innocent meeting seemed to be a conspiracy. When he learned that priests in the village of Nob had given shelter to David, Saul ordered all 85 of them executed. Since Saul trusted no one, he decided he must kill David himself. Accompanied by an armed retinue, he hunted his enemy throughout the Judean countryside. The pursuit evolved into a contest of wits between two expert guerrilla fighters. Saul soon had David cornered in the wilderness of Maon, but he was called away to fight the Philistines before he could slay the fugitive. That conflict out of the way, Saul quickly turned to his primary obsession. He trailed David into the wilderness of En-Gedi, a bleak region along the western edge of the Dead Sea. The area's pock-marked limestone outcroppings were filled with caves that offered good hiding places. Saul halted his troop at a spot known as Wild Goats Rocks and went into one of these caverns to relieve himself. At the entrance of the cave, light seemed to glow from the blue-green moss that cloaked the walls, but within a few feet Saul was surrounded by almost total darkness. He could not know that he had chosen the very cave where David and his little band of followers had sought refuge. But David recognized Saul in the dim light from the entrance. He crept up silently behind the king, careful not to dislodge any pebbles or slip in the dust of the dry cave floor. He could easily have slit Saul's throat as his men urged him to do. Instead, he cut off the edge of the king's robe and retreated. Saul left the cave, and when he had moved some distance away, David emerged holding up the piece of cloth. He called out to Saul, By the fact that I cut off the skirt of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hand. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. Saul wept with shame. You are more righteous than I, he said, for you have repaid me good, whereas if I have repaid you evil. I know that you shall surely be king. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my descendants after me. David agreed, and they parted company once more. Shortly thereafter, Samuel died, and, like all the Israelites, Saul grieved. Once the period of mourning was ended, however, Saul's penitence vanished. His obsession now drove him after David into the wilderness of Ziph, part of the great Judean desert that extends from the central watershed to the Dead Sea near the Dead Sea. Mountains of soft white chalk are cut by deep, craggy gorges, forming natural caves. In these caves, the fugitive David found refuge, as he had other fugitives throughout history. When Saul's army camped on the hill of Hachilah by the road of the East Jeshimon, David was watching. That night, he and one of his men stole into the camp and entered Saul's tent. David resisted his companion's pleas to murder the sleeping king. He merely took Saul's javelin and the water jug that sat by his head and slithily departed. The next morning was almost a repeat of the scene at Wild Ghost Rocks. From a distance, David produced the evidence that he had refrained from striking the mortal blow, and Saul was again contrite, saying, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly. He sent David on his way. The final battle. If David was still at large, so were the Philistines. They again marshaled their armies at Azpek and proceeded north to the plain of Jezreel. Along the route, they were joined by supporting armies from other sea peoples and their allies in the Canaanite city-states. Saul mustered his troops and went to meet the enemy, marching to a point near the town of Jezreel, about 7 miles west of the Jordan and 40 miles north of Gibeah. There they camped a base of Mount Gibeah, a 1,700-foot peak that forms the northern spur of the highlands as they drop away from the plain into the plain. When Saul viewed the opposition he was about to encounter, he was struck by fear, for the enemy soldiers streamed across the plain toward him. Swordsmen, archers, spears, throwers, cavalrymen, charioteers, all of them were well protected by armor, were being positioned for the attack. Absorbed in his manic pursuit of David, he had abandoned his usual strategy and allowed himself to be lured into an indefensible position. In the past, the Philistines' superior numbers and heavier equipment were rendered impotent by Saul's lightning attack in the rugged terrain of the highlands. But here at Jezreel, he was forced to fight on their terms. His skilled military eye could see that the chariot corps all alone would crush his relatively small force, trained only in the hit and run strategy of guerrilla warfare. The Philistines had all the power they required, as well as reinforcements, within easy reach at all strongholds of Megiddo and Bethshan. Even worse, they had aligned themselves so that Saul was cut off from the Galilean Israelites tribe to the north, where he might have sought the additional support he so urgently needed. Saul's confidence was completely shattered. He prayed to the Lord for assistance, but the Lord did not answer. For the king grew desperate that he broke one of his own laws. He consulted a medium, that which, however, conjured up the angry ghost of Samuel, who foretold Saul's death. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord will give you into the hand of the Philistines. The next morning, with Samuel's death sentence in his hands, Saul groped his men for a last stand near the summit of Gibeah. Although there was little room in which to maneuver, it was preferable to confront the enemy on the flatlands, but the hordes that stormed up the slope were more than Saul's force could cope with. The Philistine archers decimated the Israelites' ranks. Jonathan and Saul's other 2 sons were among the first to die. Saul himself fought valiantly, but suddenly an arrow struck him. As blood gushed from his wound, he pleaded with his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, unless these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and make sport of me." The servant could not bring himself to do it. Saul then grasped his own sword and fell upon it, killing himself. All the remaining Israelites were also slain by the Philistines. On the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to their idols and to the people. They put his armor in the temple of Asheroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethsan. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh heard that what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons were from the wall of Bethsan. And they came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. All of Israel mourned the death of their troubled king, but the greatest tribute came from David, the man he had tried to kill so often. When news of the defeat on Gibeah was brought to him, he lamented with these words, "Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death. They were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Yea, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you daintily in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle?" Hello, my name is Juan, and thank you for tuning in to this station, New Way to Live. Listen, we can't do it without your help. We need you to send your donations in today. This is how this station operates, and we're trying to do the very best for you and your family with the production that we have. We are really giving it our all, but we cannot continue it without your financial support. So please send your offerings in to P.O. Box 3615, Columbus, Georgia 3631903, in care of New Way to Live, and we'll make sure that we get it on so we can keep this great program going. If you and your family are enjoying it, we pray that you continue we pray that you send us a offering that we can continue it and do the very best for you. Also, make sure that you watch our public education program. This is a very special program where it can help you prepare for your next test. The public education program right here on New Way to Live. Thank you. Did you know that the majority of people have no will, trust, or power of attorney? What will happen to your children, property, or other assets? If you can't make decisions for yourself, who will know your wishes? Will the appropriate people know where to find all of your personal and financial documentations and information? Well, we have a program developed by attorneys to complete at your own pace from the comfort of your home. You can update this program as needed with no add-ons or surprise fees. You can secure all of your important information in this virtual password-protected safety deposit box with easy-to-use services and client support system available. Please call me today at 706-366-5520. Again, call me today at 706-366-5520. I hope to hear from you soon.